Fencing types and costs. Let's just start out with, when we talk about fencing, there are a lot of characteristics we want in our fence. We'd like our fence to be visible. Certainly, if we have feeder calves or horses, this is probably a very high priority item, making sure the animals know where the fence is. That it's tall enough they can't get over it. Solid, strong, those would be nice so they don't go through it. Something inexpensive, wouldn't that be lovely? It's a little difficult today to do an inexpensive fence, but that's a priority for a lot of us, right? That we have to pick a fencing material that we can afford. I would like mine to be low maintenance because I work this job that I'm here for today in addition to the farm. And I want it to last a long time. You know, I tell people that my husband and I have put up probably a couple miles of fence in the last couple of years. And that's not a huge amount of fence, but I don't want to do it again. My goal is to only do it once, and then the next time the next generation has to take lead on it. But in order to do that, I have to spend more money, right? That's part of the trade-off. So everyone's going to look at these priorities and they're going to rank them differently. And they're going to build different types of fence. And my inherent bias is that I like electric fencing. I tell people this all the time. I know this is an inherent bias that I have. And part of it is because we had a tornado go through in 2018 and we had put in some new smooth wire electric high tensile fence. And when the tornado came through, we had a rental house and the person called and said the roof is off of the house, and I thought they meant they'd lost the shingles. They did not. They meant they'd lost the rafters, they'd lost the ceiling joists, they'd lost the whole roof off of the house, and they were looking up at the sky when they came out of the basement. And all of that roof was sitting in my alpaca pen. A lot of it was sitting on the fence, in fact. And what ended up happening is that fence, we just popped all of the roofing material off, left it in the field, pushed the alpacas together in the other side of that pen, turned on the solar box, and the animals were contained that night. That fence worked extremely well for what I needed at that point in time. And so for me, that makes that type of fence really effective. But it's certainly not the most visible fence out there. And so someone else might have a different priority in terms of building a fence. So it's something to just keep in mind that everyone's going to have different priorities in their fencing, but because of cost, because of its durability, I've been very happy with that style of fence. There are a bunch of different fences that are out there on the market. I'm going to talk about the most common fencing types here in Kentucky. So we don't see a lot of pipe fence here, although we're starting to see a little bit more of it, unless it's in a working facility. We're going to talk about wood plank, woven wire, fixed knot high tensile, smooth wire high tensile, which needs to be electrified in my opinion, and barbed wire. And we'll talk about each one of these and then talk a little bit about the costs associated with them. For all of the costs in this talk, we're going to use a Virginia Tech fencing calculator. And I know we're here in Kentucky, but this is a beautiful calculator and one that was not necessary for us to reproduce. This calculator allows you to enter in your own costs for materials, for posts, for fence fabric, different wires you would use, as well as allowing for a labor cost and an equipment cost. I've assigned that we're doing 1,000 foot of fence in each one of these scenarios. So the cost is per 1,000 foot. I'll probably announce what that cost is on a per foot basis, and it's just divided by 1,000. I've put braces on both ends, and I've put a couple larger posts in the center. On some of that wire, that means I have to have braces in that center every 330 feet. Other types of fencing, I don't need all those braces. But I have at least 2 extra large posts in the center of my line to allow for some topography. My larger posts are 6/7s, a tapered post, 6 to 7 inch diameter, and they're 8 foot long so that I have enough length on them to get them about 4 foot in the ground, at least 3.5. My line posts are 7 foot long, so I'm trying to aim for almost 3 feet in the ground, and I've put 4 to 5s on there. I know that we could go as low as a 3-4, but I just told you I didn't want to rebuild a fence in my lifetime, and a 3-4 post is going to slowly work its way away pretty quickly. So I would prefer to lean towards a 4-5 for my line post just for the lifespan on them. Certainly I'd like a 7-8 for my corner and brace posts, but that's quite expensive. So I've sort of met in the middle there, and that's where I've ended up. I have labor in there. I will announce that this is how I would do labor if I was trying to build a fence and I was just trying to account for my time. I have like $10 an hour for manual labor, and then I have an equipment cost on there, which is certainly under what someone else would charge you, but it would be enough to at least account for some wear and tear on some equipment. My braces are going to take 3/4 of an hour, my double braces 1 hour and 1/4. Driving the post about 6 minutes. For those brace and corner posts that are bigger, that are going a little bit further, 8 minutes. If you're doing this for the first time and you're going to build this fence, that's not the time that you're going to spend doing it. This is just to give you an idea on cost, to give yourself something to work off of. And then stapling wire at 7 minutes per post, and then unrolling and stretching the fence 0.7 minutes per foot. So that just gives you a rough idea on cost. This is not what I would expect someone else to charge me. I wouldn't try and negotiate with a contractor with these numbers, but at least if I'm doing my own fencing, I can compare different types of fence. If I'm doing an NRCS project and I'm doing all the work, I sort of have an idea what I'm spending in terms of my time and energy, and all of those numbers can be adjusted to reflect what you need it to see at. Wood plank fence. Wood plank is the one fence up here that doesn't have any brace posts in it. And that's because it doesn't have any bracing in it. This is not a fence that depends on tension, so there's no structure that pulls against those corners. Wood posts every 8 feet. Board planks, 16 foot long. I've done, in my comparison here, a 4-board wood plank. And the reason that I've gone with 4-board is because 3-board will hold in an animal, 4-board will hold in the animal when one of those planks is down. Because 2-board is not actually very effective at holding in animals, and always there's 1 board down somewhere on the plank fence. So for conservation, I want to make sure that I put in a 4-board plank fence here. The challenge with a plank fence is it's a very expensive fence. There's a lot of material. I've done this with wood posts and poplar planks on it. It's a nice material. It's very attractive for people that want to put something up that's aesthetically pleasing on a road frontage because their business has a lot of public face on it, or they have animals that need that visibility. It's a good fence. The challenge is the cost and the maintenance. That's where we have challenges. There's a lot of maintenance involved in having a plank fence because planks have limited lifespan. You can see here that I have material cost a little over $5 a foot. Labor costs I have only in here at $1.50 a foot. The challenge with this is I still have the same time for driving a post on here. And the reality is if I have posts every 8 feet and they really have to be on 8 feet, it's going to be a little bit slower unless I'm a professional and I do this all the time. On top of which, if I have any rock, which I'm sure you don't have any rock here, do you? No one has rock on their farms around here. I live in Boyle County, so I know that you guys have rock around here because I do. And just getting all those posts exactly where we need them, and the fact that we don't have any flexibility in driving those posts into the ground means that that labor cost is going to go up dramatically. All of this is for an unpainted, unfinished fence, because I'm going to put this whole fence up and then I'm going to wait 6 months or a year and I'm going to paint everything once that wood is all cured out, when it's going to take in that paint. So there's no maintenance cost in here, no final touch-up on getting paint on all of this material. This is just to put the posts in the ground and get those boards up. Realistically, we're like half of what a contractor would be, best case scenario right here. Chris will tell us how expensive it is if you're the University of Kentucky trying to get plank fence. It's not pretty. Woven wire fence. This is the standard fence that most people expect to see on their perimeters with neighbors. This is what we've traditionally used. Woven wire fence is a nice product in the sense that it really handles not being maintained well. When we get shrubs and brush and other things growing up in a fence, woven wire fences tend to handle that a lot better than some of the other materials that we're going to describe, like wood plank wouldn't like that. Electrified fences don't like that. Barbed wire doesn't love it, although it takes it a little bit better than some of those other materials. But woven wire is one of those better fences on a perimeter where someone is not going to maintain the fence line well. It does have some visibility, and so it's a really nice option for a perimeter for securing a fence for animals, where you really have a pretty strong barrier there. For 1,000 foot of fence, we're talking about a material cost that's a little under $3 a foot and a labor cost that's about $1.50 a foot. And that's a pretty inexpensive cost on that labor side, but I said before I'm putting in $10 an hour on my time, and I'm not really charging a significant amount on the labor here. Overall, that puts us a little over $4.30 a foot, which is not a terrible cost internally to absorb, but is not going to be the cheapest option that we see today. The other type of fence I want to just touch on here is a fixed, not high tensile. That's what we're going to see today. I see they have a little sample of it here in the back of the room. A fixed, not high tensile fence and a woven wire fence look very similar. If you're just looking at them from the road, you're not probably going to identify the differences. The difference is a high tensile metal is a higher carbon metal, and it has memory and less stretch than a standard steel wire that you would see on a traditional woven wire fence. Or I think they're going to use the term hinged knot fence. The fixed knot high tensile fence, because of that memory and because of the design of those knots, is a more structural member. It will hold itself up much better than a standard woven wire. The vertical stays are continuous all the way down. They provide support in that fence that allows that fence to stand up. What that means is that when we go to a fixed knot high tensile over a standard woven wire, we have more flexibility in where we put our line posts. We can move our line posts out to 20 feet, maybe even 25 if we have really flat ground, which I don't expect many people have really flat ground around here, but if you had a really nice long flat stretch, you could even stretch them a little bit further if you needed to. This is one of the main reasons that this fence comes in quite a bit cheaper than a standard woven wire. Our material costs are less, and that's primarily in the number of posts that we have. On a standard woven wire, we need a post every 12 feet. We don't have a lot of option about that. That's about how often we need one to keep that woven wire standing up, keep it from sagging too much over time. This fixed knot high tensile it has much less stretch in it, so it's not going to sag the same way, and so we can get away with stretching our posts out. It also gives us a little more flexibility if we're in rocky areas, that we can move our post spacing around if we need to jump over a shelf of rock or something. So not always can we stretch it that far, but sometimes we can get a few less posts in that rock, which is really nice. And because we have less posts, our labor cost also goes down because we have less things to drive into the ground and staple to, if you want to describe it. We come out just under $3 a foot with this type of material. The next type of fence I just want to touch on is that smooth wire, high tensile electrified fence. You can see here that in these images, for some people, they really love the look of this fence and other people dislike it. It's not very visible, so this is not the most visible option. So if you have animals that are not trained to electric, this might not be the first fence that you want them to see on a road frontage necessarily, right? You wouldn't want them to go through it because they didn't recognize that it was there. The key to this fence is it has to be hot. We're going to talk today about a 5-wire. We can go down to a 4-wire in theory, but on a perimeter, I would generally say that most people would want at least 5 wires, just so they have enough height and dimension there to keep animals from working their way through that fence. The importance, though, is that it's electrified, because we can do the same thing that we did with the fixed knot high tensile with the smooth wire high tensile. We can space out our posts quite a bit, and we don't need as many posts in the ground from the structure of the fence standpoint. So the benefit of this high tensile is that we end up with a fairly inexpensive fence. In fact, this is our cheapest option that we're going to, I don't want to ruin the surprise, but this is going to be our cheapest fence. Our Our material costs are going to be low. We're talking cents per foot on that smooth wire, high tensile. And we don't have that many posts. Similar to the last fence, we're able to take a number of posts out of this fence. We come out right around $2, just over $2 a foot with this design. The key is we do have some maintenance with this. In order to keep a fence like this going, we cannot let stuff grow into the fence. We can't have trees growing in it or big brush. So we do have to make sure we're doing maintenance with this type of fence. Sometimes if we have small ruminants, they'll eat under that fence for us, so that's kind of nice for those of us that have those. And then last but not least is the barbed wire fence. And this is the one that people tell me is the cheapest option, but what we're going to see here is that this is actually not the cheapest option, and debatably, it might not even be cheaper than fixed knot high tensile, depending on how we build it. A 4-strand barbed wire fence, most barbed wire today is also a high tensile material. That's the most common style that we see. The benefit of that is that we do have a little bit more flexibility in our post spacing, but because we do not electrify barbed wire, I think I should repeat that, we should not be electrifying barbed wire. We don't want to space out our posts too far because we need those posts vertically to hold that fence up and to make sure that that barbed wire doesn't move and that animals can't work their way through the fence. And I know some people will say that their animals don't go through barbed wire, but they will get through it if we leave the post spacing too far. So in this design, we actually end up moving our posts back closer together to about every 12 feet again, 12 to 14 feet. And we have a little bit more post spacing, which causes us to have more labor on this material. And we come out at about $2.50 here a foot, which is not that much less than the $3 a foot on that fixed knot high tensile fence. And depending on how we do our post spacing and how we design this fence, we come out pretty similar a lot of times in cost between those two types of fencing. Something to keep in mind. I personally don't like to maintain a barbed wire fence. I don't like having to go get my gloves just to re-stretch something or to retie if a wire breaks or a tree lands on something. That's just a personal preference from having to maintain it over older barbed wire fences, a personal dislike that I have. And I know other people have barbed wire that they find maintenance to be challenging on as well. So something to keep in mind. It's certainly an effective fence in the sense that a lot of animals don't like going through a barbed wire fence in the same way I don't like going through a barbed wire fence. When we talk about these fences, one of the things I will say is that all those designs that I've talked about so far have been primarily wood posts. I haven't talked about other options for posts, treated wood posts. If I'm building a fence and I'm putting in wood posts, I am going to be putting in treated wood posts. And the reason for that is because the lifespan you can see between a pressure-treated and an untreated piece of wood is significant. I would have a very hard time justifying putting anything into a fence line that wasn't pressure-treated wood. Also, steel posts are a really nice option. They're fairly low cost. They're pretty forgiving. They certainly are not what I'd want to use on a brace or a corner post, but certainly in the line, especially if I have a lot of rock, that might be something that I can utilize to get through areas that are a little more difficult. They're not going to be as strong as a wood post, so I wouldn't want to do a whole line of them and then have a lot of pressure on that fence line. But if I needed to include them in there, it would probably drop the cost of my materials on some of those fences. So there's options there. I just haven't in my design put any of those in there. I sort of use them to fill in gaps when my posts break off in my line later. And so that's how I've sort of approached this design. Like, that's a filling material later down the road. Also, for people that are doing high tensile electric, smooth wire, you know, a steel T-post is basically a ground rod in the middle of your fence. So there are a lot of reasons not to utilize them with electric fencing, or not to use them as heavily with electric fencing if you can avoid it. There are fiberglass options out there that are pretty interesting. And so there are certainly things that are coming on the market that might be other options depending on where you're putting in your fence. One of the things that is worth noting about all of this is the key to all of this is to get your fences right. The last thing you want to do is take all this money that we're talking about investing, dollars per foot, thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how large your farm is, and putting in a fence that ends up being not where you want it. At the very least, we should get our perimeters built correctly. But before we do a lot of work on our interior fence, we want to do a lot of really intentional planning. We want to make sure that we understand what size pastures and paddocks we need. And do we need a variety of sizes? Because instinctively, if someone shows me a plan, they will have all their pastures the same size. They will have cut the farm so that every pasture is 5 acres or 10 acres or 20 acres. And the answer is some places that's the right decision, and in other places that doesn't actually match the management on the farms. So for me, I have bulls, and they only go in for 60 days and then they come out. I have to have somewhere to house my bulls when they're not in with my cows. And they don't need the same size pasture as my cow herd. They need a small pasture. And when I wean my calves, I sometimes will hold them for 45 or 60 days, or maybe longer, depending on what the market looks like. And I might have weaned calves in a field, but I might not need the same size field for those weaned calves that I would be using for my cow herd as well. So each person's going to have a little bit different operation, a little bit different grouping, and so you might want some different size pastures or paddocks depending on how you're utilizing your land. That's something to consider before we put in all these permanent fences. One of the strategies that we talk about here and at the grazing school a lot is to create really large pastures with permanent fencing and then use temporary fencing to create smaller management areas. And some people do this as like an intermediate step and eventually go to more permanent fences in their interiors. And some people stay with temporary because it allows more flexibility if they're going to use some of these pastures as hayfields, or they just don't want to put in the cost of putting in all permanent fence because there's a lot of maintenance associated with a lot of permanent fence. So different people, different preferences, all of that again is up to you when you make your own decisions on your farms. If you are going to use temporary fencing, the one thing I want you to know is there are a lot of different temporary posts out there on the market. So a lot of people will say, oh, I went to somewhere and they only had pigtails and one other style of post and they were really crappy and they're not going to work for me because I have sheep and they're lambing and those small lambs, they just walk right through and nothing works and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of different types of temporary posts on the market, and there's a lot of different qualities of temporary posts that are on the market. So you're going to want to decide how much you're going to utilize these materials, and then you're going to want to pick ones that are going to work for your farm and that are going to have enough durability to get taken up and put down regularly. Also with that temporary fence, there's different wires and strands that are available. And sort of on that permanent fence, I talked about the importance of visibility, but it's really important on these temporary fences too, especially if we have animals that are not well trained to temporary fence. We can choose materials that are very visible to first educate our animals, keep it nice and hot, really get them to understand what a hot fence is. Things like those poly ropes and that poly tape are very effective for training animals. I wouldn't necessarily want to run that everywhere because for me, the portability, the ability to roll them up is a little bit more challenging than the thinner turbo wires and things like that. But from a training perspective, the visibility on them is extremely nice. I will acknowledge that most of these temporary materials have a shorter lifespan than a traditional wire fence does, right? I mean, they're out in the sun, they do degrade over time. Some of the newer materials do a little bit better than older materials. And overall, all of them have less conductivity than a 12.5 gauge high tensile steel wire. They are all going to resist the flow of electricity more than the wire that we talked about for the permanent fence. And what that means is that we're going to have to be a little bit more careful when we choose our Energizer to make sure it's the right size and that it can carry enough current and voltage energy out to keep those fences charged, because all those wires have different capacities for carrying current. And the poly wires really, I say approximately half as much distance as steel aluminum. I think that's a generous offer there to say that they could take up half as much distance. I think even less than that in a lot of cases, although some of the newer turbo wires and things like that that are on the market carry current much better than those older polywire materials. Also, with the electrified fencing, we have two options when we do this, and Jeremy will talk about this more. We have an earth return and a wire return. Most places here in Kentucky, we get away with an earth return. It's very effective, and that means that all of our wires are hot, and then all that current comes back to our Energizer if we're creating a circuit by touching that fence with an animal through the ground. For anyone that has small ruminants around here, that wire return is a really nice option because it'll shock them really good when they don't have a lot of good hoof contact with the ground and they don't necessarily get the amount of shock through the ground that we might like. So I use a wire return system for my alpacas, I'm 100% honest, but my cattle have earth return systems on most of their pens. So it's a personal preference to which way you want to go. But I would say most people should use an earth return. And the key with all of this, with the electrified fencing, is grounding. So we talked about the cost of the fence, but the one thing you don't want to do is to neglect to put in the right Energizer and the right grounding system, because when we talk about a fence that uses electricity, these are the keys, and they're not that expensive to get right. This is not where we want to fail, is in that last little bit, that last little hurdle. If we're going to use electricity as part of our fencing scheme, we want to make sure we get that electricity right. That means we need those 3 ground rods, at least 3 ground rods, 6 feet in the ground, 10 foot apart, to give ourselves a big enough antenna to capture all that energy that's going to go through that animal, back through the ground, and back to that Energizer. One final thought here. I've talked a lot about using electricity on our fences. I personally have, in all of my fences that I've built, instead of running a barbed wire on the top of any fixed knot, high tensile, or woven wire fences I've built, I've run an electrified strand on the top and inside of that fence for 2 reasons. One, it gives me electricity everywhere on the farm, and I don't have to have ground rods in 35 places and move my solar box around. I can just have one power source that's feeding the whole farm, and I don't have to bring power out if I want to do some temporary fencing. The other thing it's done is it's giving me another way to discourage animals from rubbing on that fence. Some people will use barbed wire for this. I personally like an electric wire. I want to train my animals to it anyway. And it's going to protect my fence long term. If I can keep that wire electrified, it's going to keep animals from rubbing on the side of the fence with their butt. Right now in the spring, when they're trying to shed all that hair, that's pretty common to see them rubbing on the posts and on the wire, trying to get, who knows what they're getting off at this point. And it also keeps them from reaching over. And if I have smaller animals, I can even run a wire low to keep predators from coming in with my small ruminants. So lots of options for using that electricity on those perimeter fences from a protection standpoint as well. Are you going to mention the offset, or do you want me to? Okay. In the manual, you will have an extension pub that Chris and Jeremy and I have worked on electrical offsets. It talks about how to build an electric offset, and it's specifically focused on how to build one for both a new fence and an old fence. One of the benefits of these electric offsets is that we can use them not only on a new fence that we've spent a lot of money building, but on an old fence. So if we have rented, leased land, and we're not willing to invest a lot of money into that fence, but we want to make sure we can still contain our animals, we can use electric offsets off of an existing fence. We talk about some of the ones that have maybe a 12-inch offset. That gives us enough space that when that fence is flexing and sagging, that we can actually have enough space that we're not going to ground out that electric wire. It's something that we can put up and then take down if we end up losing our lease, so we don't lose all those materials. But it gives us a little more security on an older fence as well. Any questions?
Is there any questions? Yeah. So on these offsets, are you using separate posts, or you're using an extension
Jeremy, are you going to show the offsets this afternoon? Jeremy's going to show you the offsets this afternoon. Primarily the ones that we really like, there's offsets that actually go into the woven wire or barbed wire. They actually tie in. That way they move with the fence, that they're not attached to the post directly, although we will show some options that would attach directly onto a post as well, because you might need a combination of both depending on what you're doing with that offset, but ideally we use that fabric of the fence and we attach to that because that gives us a little bit more flexibility on especially on a looser fence that's got some sag to it.
There is that publication, it's in the electric fencing section, probably halfway back. It's a really nice little publication, so take a look at that. And Jeremy will demonstrate the offsets in the field this afternoon. Extremely powerful tool for controlling grazing, because once you get an offset around the perimeter fence, we can subdivide that pasture any way we want to manage grazing.
I know that we're talking about fencing, but when you do a cost share or they give you the measurements of how much they can allocate for fencing, are we going to talk anything about gates that are included, or whether one gate is better for one type of fencing?
This is a great question. So I don't think we're going to talk on gates too much today. I will say that I have done a lot of fencing, some NRCS, some state cost share projects on my farms, and the gates are always the thing that bites us because we always add more gates than really are covered by their calculations. But my opinion is if I'm building a fence, I don't want to ever be at a point where I think I have to cut the fence to get equipment through. And it is a challenge. So anytime we're hanging a gate, we want our post, and ideally we want our brace and our post set up so that they're hanging so that the gate is in line with them. And so that means that we got to be really careful about how we lay out so that we can get those gates set up. A lot of times sometimes that means a 16-foot gate is enough. Sometimes we end up with double gates. Sometimes we end up putting gates at like a water tank that's getting shared, and sometimes we have to put them other places. That's a pretty site-specific decision. The one thing I will say is some people will instinctively buy the heaviest gate known to man, and my husband is one of them, every time we want to put a gate anywhere on the farm. And I have to remind him, like, that's a really heavy gate. That's hard on the post. So it depends on how much usage and how much pressure there is going to be on a gate as to what level of durability we need in those gates. The cheapest gates are probably always going to be a challenge. It's going to be hard to maintain them long-term for the lifespan of the fence. But you certainly don't necessarily need to go to the heaviest bull gate either if you're putting it out in your back pasture.
I know there's a strategy for the gate, but there's also a calculation whether or not they did calculate the gates that are needed for a fencing project.
Yeah, so in most cases, NRCS has a cost per foot for fencing in general, and they don't necessarily always pay for gates. Gates are sort of on you to figure out. One of the benefits of the high tensile fence is it's inexpensive enough that I can sometimes figure out how to fit gates into that cost, whereas sometimes with some of the other fencing materials, if I'm using them on an interior fence for a rotational system, that just becomes an out-of-pocket cost for me. And right now it's a little bit tricky because some of the NRCS specs have started moving around. I've traditionally used NRCS specs to do these designs, but right now NRCS wants on the high tensile electric a post every 14 feet, and I sort of disagree with that fundamentally, so I've chosen not to follow the NRCS spec right now. Yeah. I would never, ever, ever use a used post on a brace or corner, ever. I probably wouldn't buy used posts for my line, but if I'm doing a fence with high tensile, the structure of my fence is in the fabric and it's in the corner and the brace posts. So if I build my corner and brace right and my posts fall out of my line, I can come in and replace them at any point. There's nothing super critical about those line posts. So if I had to do a fence and I was really pressured on cost, or I could find really good used posts that were like a third of the price of new, and I had a lot of fencing to do, I might consider a used post in a line, but I would never, ever, ever use one for a brace or corner on a fence. There's no reason to, because if those fall over, if they wear out, the whole fence comes down, right? Whereas a line post, I can pull out a line post and replace another post in that line structurally, especially on the high tensile materials, a lot easier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was looking at it towards the leasing standpoint. I have a place that has existing high tensile, and some of those posts are getting bad, but it's also I don't own the property. I try not to,
You don't want to spend money you don't have to.
Yeah.
if you're not taking it with you, it's hard to put.
Yep.
But I want to be a good manager.
I think if you can find good used posts, that would be a reasonable spot in a line. I just wouldn't probably replace it on a brace or corner.
So probably not railroad ties and,
No.
and not utility poles, right?
No, those would be not ideal. The railroad tie is just going to split out, and it becomes pretty messy pretty quick, typically. They have gone out of this world. Yeah, they've gone up significantly. Now, they have stabilized. They stabilized a little bit faster than metal prices, but they're still high. They haven't come down necessarily, if that makes sense. So at least we can kind of predict what they are currently. They're not moving around a lot and the availability has stabilized as well, which is good.
I have seen people start to do steel posts, welding, corner posts and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is that becoming available in Kentucky, like weld pipe and stuff? Do that?
We're starting to see some well pipe here. When we get to the field, we're going to do braces this afternoon, and a 10-foot brace is significantly stronger than an 8-foot brace, and a 10-foot post is an unreasonable cost. So steel, at least on the horizontal member in an H brace, is very common at this point. So people are bringing in oil pipe and things like that, even if they're just using it for bracing. So you're starting to see more of it. You're also seeing people use it on handling facilities for cattle. We're starting to see more continuous fence there. And so I think because of that, more stuff is coming in. It's certainly an option on a corner. It's a very viable option. Out west, they use them all the time. We don't see as many people build with it here just because they're not so familiar with the process. And a lot of times there is some welding associated. So if you don't have a mobile welder, it's a more challenging process, if that makes sense.
Well, I actually do have a mobile welding service, so that would benefit me potentially, but
Yes.
is that something that would be able to electrify with certain insulators, high tensile, or how do you?
Well, it's a dead ground, right? So if it's a
Yeah.
piece of metal in the ground and the insulator breaks, I mean, that's a dead short in the fence.
Yeah.
Whereas an insulator breaks on a wood post, well,
It's a leak on a wood post and it's a ground on a, that is one of the challenges with metal fencing is it's not.
We probably
inherently
need
for
to
that.
move on to our next speaker. Let's thank Morgan for her presentation.